Again at the Solo 2 and Only You Studios. I'm Vince and Dr. Patino in his office. Real quick, thank you to all of you, all our viewers. You've hit a milestone for us 2 million views, actually over 2 million views and 10,000 subscribers. We appreciate that. But please continue to spread the word, share, follow, like, and subscribe. It would help. We'd like to keep moving on and providing you with the information that you get here every week live with Dr. Patino. Please do remember that this is a live podcast and you can click on and actually ask questions of Dr. Patino during our little talk here. How are you today, sir?
Hey Vincent, I'm doing great. I just went to leave my daughter in college, and it was a recurring experience. I've done that before, but it's always sad, to see your last kid go. So, an emotional experience last weekend. But in general, I'm doing very well. Working in the hospital, working here at the office, and trying to help people find less destructive ways of dealing with their emotional and behavioral issues, which is at the end the purpose of what we do. And again, I used to remind people, thank you very much for watching us. 2 million, it's quite a milestone for us, and we want to increase the subscribers. So please click subscribe and watch us in the different media that we're present.
So you mentioned working, of course, that's your job every day, dealing with people's feelings, emotions, illnesses, as well as just little bumps in the road, psychologically speaking. However, there's one that seems to affect us all in an interesting way, and that is fear. Fear pushes us to do some pretty amazing and sometimes very disturbing behaviors. Fear, you've mentioned before, is important for survival, right? If you're walking down the road and there's a bush with a tan tail and a black tuft on it, you should might be a little afraid that that could be a lion, right? If you're in Africa, and take the appropriate response. But in a situation like here in the United States, where we're relatively safe, we live in the least violent time in history. Why is fear so prevalent, especially in this political climate, and of course with COVID?
Well, I mean, I always like to say and explain to my patients that the mother of all fears is uncertainty, right? So we are reptilians that are programmed to react to uncertainty, to react to situations that are threatening. And they can be acute situations like another animal or thing trying to hurt you, or a situation that may lead to not being able to be safe in terms of long term eating, sleeping, shelter, those kinds of things. So, at a very basic level, we all have the ability to feel and react to fear, but we have to remember that uncertainty is a mother of fear, that sometimes is present as anxiety. Anxiety is basically the excessive worrying about uncertain situations, and sometimes in an irrational way, not in a delusional way, but somewhat irrational, because experience and day-to-day life tells you that that situation is highly unlikely to occur. Um, but we have to understand that in many situations, being afraid is totally adaptive and is totally normal. So, in terms of defending ourselves, defending our family, being able to manage uh, uncertainty under certain situations with the tools that are being provided for us becomes a rational and an acceptable way of handling fear. Part of the problem for us being intellectual means is that we want fear to be rational all the time. And
And predictable and simple and defeatable.
exactly. So what happens is many people view fear as weakness, right? And when you start perceiving fear as weakness, then you have an internal conflict, right? Because if you're being perceived as weak and you don't want to be perceived as weak, or you perceive yourself as being weak, you have to present yourself in a way that others don't see you as being weak, that others perceive you as you being in control, right? But control requires purpose, right? And response to fear requires purpose. So we don't have to convince ourselves that we're in control. We need to be in control, right? So by being perceptive of ourselves as being weak, then we start manifesting a self that does not um, belong to us. And second, that it negates the threat, right? And that's when things get very dangerous. When your fear makes you to react in ways that not unusually are aggressive, but quite frequently are irrational, meaning that you are negating the presence of the fear. So let me give you an example. We have heard this for the last 18, 20 months. You know, COVID is not real. Okay. That's a rationalization that is irrational. Excuse my language. So the reality is that COVID, there's enough evidence to support the fact, okay, that COVID is real and that COVID is not the flu and that COVID kills people. But if I accept the threat of COVID, then I may be perceived as being weak. So, hence the way that people react is in an aggressive, irrational way. So they start arguing with you in sometimes very aggressive, ways. We have seen the development of the Karen, the person who reacts with a lot of anger in quite irrational ways and would not stop talking, right? So, what is happening there? You're seeing the person probably having underlying fear and reacting in irrational, angry ways and not listening,
Mm.
right? So, you cannot have a conversation with somebody who's afraid and aggressive because what they're trying to do is to distance you from any potential way of convincing them that the threat is real, right? So then you see all of these things that we see that have become very popular in social media, that sometimes we even make fun of because it's so irrational that you end up being too aggressive.
And is that why fear so often leads to anger?
Absolutely. You can say that anger in some ways is an irrational reflection of your anger. And irrational because it doesn't lead to a purpose of making you safer, right?
So an irrational reflection of your fear, actually.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it doesn't, the purpose of that reflection is not for you to be safer, is to protect anybody from seeing you as being weak and angry,
Mm.
right? So that wall gets built and is very difficult to take down, right? Because the only way they can be taken down is by initiating the process of helping people understand that in order for them to be less angry, they need to feel more secure and less afraid. That becomes a particularly important situation in my culture, in the Hispanic Mexican culture, because for Hispanic male in particular, it's very difficult to recognize their own fear.
Mm.
It's like an automatic response that if I'm afraid, I'm not culturally adequate and I'm weak. So I'm going to do anything that is required to prevent that fear from showing up. And that is in the context of the average individual. Well, I'm not talking about the severely pathological narcissist. That's a whole new different story that we can talk about in a different situation. It's just that not uncommonly things can escalate to the point of violence,
Mm.
right? Because you're making me feel afraid. Let me use an example of domestic violence, right? Um, there's been a pattern of domestic violence in a couple, right? And the the victim of the violence basically starts making plans to leave, right? And the person who's the aggressor starts becoming more aggressive,
Mm.
which is kind of senseless, right? Because the person needs to protect himself or herself from the violence and they need to move away from that situation. and the person is becoming more aggressive, pushing them away further, right?
Hmm.
But at the end, what is happening is that either the person is terribly narcissistic and antisocial, or is very afraid that the person is leaving.
Hmm.
And the only way he can manifest that aggression is by not showing his fear and showing more aggression, right? So there are a lot of situations that happen in day-to-day life that could be started to be understood and solved by understanding the underlying cause of the behavior, right? I mean, not all domestic violence situations are narcissists and sociopaths. Some of them are very insecure men who are very afraid, and the only way they allow themselves to manifest their fear is in aggressive ways.
Is that why so many people, again, in some of the worlds I work in the special operations worlds, not so much, but in the civilian self-defense and shooting world, boy, go to any parking lot of a shooting facility and you'll see the lifted trucks with the flags and the Punisher skulls and protected by AR-15. I mean, there's this projection of aggression and badassery, for lack of a better term, that is over the top, and it's quite often very amusing when you see the person who climbs out of that truck being kind of a pudgy, overweight guy with a bunch of tactical gear. Um, but is that why they're projecting that image, or maybe the biker, or any of these caricatures, really, of masculinity? Is that really what's happening?
You can generalize that's always the case, but that's definitely the case in some situations, right? I mean, you can see the whole gamut of issues in cult type of situations, right? Whether the cult is religion, or the cult is biking, or the cult is sports, or the cult is martial arts, right? Some people will be very humbled, and very self acknowledged, and they have a very relaxed meditating way of being, and other people are going to be uh needing that the whole world knows that they're in martial arts, right?
Wearing the T-shirt and
Exactly.
yeah,
I mean, you show up to work and with the whole stuff, right?
yeah.
So the same thing happens with guns. I mean, guns have become a symbol of aggression and power, when in reality, most people that own guns are not into that.
Mm.
They are into hunting and self-protection, and a lot of people go to the shooting range and shoot their guns, and they don't bother anybody, and they're not showing up at protests with guns and rifles and AK-47s, right? So we have a small size of the population who tends to give a bad word to everybody else, right? So let's use biking, right? You have bikers and you have people who practice biking, and there are clubs of biking, and not everybody who's in the club of biking is at the extreme.
Mm.
But when we get to the extremes, you have to be able to identify purpose, right? And I keep going back to purpose because everything we do has to have a purpose, right? So if somebody comes to me and says, I'm not going to get vaccinated, I have to ask the question, what is your purpose of not getting vaccinated? Right? I mean, because if the purpose is political, or the purpose is social, or the purpose is fear, let's talk about it. Not to convince you to not to follow your purpose, but be aware of your purpose, you know, because this is you. This is not everybody else. This is you. So what is the purpose of doing what we do? What is the purpose of being in martial arts? What is the purpose of owning a gun? What is the purpose of biking? Right? And the purpose can be multiple. It can be social, it can be personal, it can be uh, altruistic, it can be all kinds of different things. But please have a purpose, right? Because I cannot have a conversation with you if I don't know what the purpose of what you do is. So it's very important to start the conversation at that level, right? Now, that assumes the basics, which have become extremely difficult right now, right? Don't judge and listen. I mean, that's it. Don't make a judgment and listen, you know, and don't automatically reject people because you're afraid.
And that and
No,
that and that
go ahead.
response and that response that people get, that verbal combativeness is really kind of push you away from actually asking those questions to a certain extent, isn't it?
Yeah, because it pushes you away from discussing the underlying issue, which is fear, right? So, I mean, w- now we have to be careful because I'm not going to tell you how to approach these things because it's complicated, right? And we, in my business, we're trained to deal with those situations to some degree, and experience gives you some guidance into how to deal with those situations. But the reality is that I'm not going to suggest that people in somebody who's confronting you about something they may be afraid of and they're becoming angry about. I'm not going to say to tell them, what are you afraid of? Because once you do that, they're going
I
to
like saying
become
calm down to an angry person doesn't work
yeah,
very well.
no, no. I mean, the best thing to do with a person who's being aggressive is to move away from the aggression, to listen, right? And if invited, to ask the question, how do you want me to help you? Because it is a process on helping someone recognize their fear. It's not an event, right? And we want everything to happen here and now. I want you to come to my office and I want to convince you to get a vaccine. It doesn't work like that. You plant seeds and you expect those things to grow, and you start learning people to trust you. And then eventually they'll tell you they're afraid, but they're not going to tell you they're afraid in a community setting. They're not going to tell you those things. So people who are struggling with regret about their anger, they're struggling with fear, I would really advise that they go and see somebody for some counseling, right? And be honest and say, I'm afraid of this. You know, it is okay to be weak. It is okay to be perceived as being weak if that means your life, and not to irrationally project your fear in angry ways and then expect people to acknowledge it.
Mm,
You mean, you see, I see a lot of angry people all the time from all ages, 11 to 100, right? I mean, I see tens of people with anger problems every day, and I have to deal with them in a lot of different ways. But the reality is that I've learned one thing, okay? And one thing is, don't judge them, okay? But also don't feel that it's your responsibility to rescue them from their anger. Okay? My responsibility as a professional that deals with these things is not to fix them, is to give them options that they can exercise to deal with those things themselves. I don't have magic wands that can make people move from anger to fear to regret and now they're fixed. It doesn't work like that. It's a very, very complicated biological, psychological, and social process. So there's a lot of people who react to these things by saying, ignore them, just leave them alone, confront them, tell them how crazy they are. No, that's not the way to dealing with people. We have to listen. And again, my job is to listen and to not judge. So I think that if we as a society can learn the basics of being non-judgmental, right? Uh, then we might be able to open the door, right, to dialogue, which is something we've lost.
So if somebody is experiencing a lot of anger, probably the best thing would be for them to find a quiet place if possible and to acknowledge to themselves at least what the etiology of that anger is and if it most a percentage of the time it will be, as you mentioned, fear. And if it is indeed fear, then finding a place where it is safe to discuss that fear, not be judged by it, not be ridiculed, and then find coping mechanisms to move away from that slowly, whether it's through with a friend, professional counseling. Are there other maybe even going to a psychiatrist? Are there other places where people can find that kind of help or even training? Because it seems to me a lot of the stuff we discuss is like the physical side. It takes a coach. takes a trainer and it takes your effort as the individual. And on the psychological side, we all have ourselves. We don't know what to do with this. Not a lot of coaches and trainers out there. So what can someone do to move forward on this if they find that themselves, or they at least come to the acknowledgement that yes, my anger is based on some fear. I'd like need to cope with that fear.
Well, the you see, people who are afraid and who react in angry ways, not unusually are dealing with a lot of shame issues, right?
Mm,
And the worst fear they have really is to be shamed, right? Because they have some underlying insecurities and low self-esteem, and so you have to externalize and manifest this in the opposite way, meaning defensive, aggressive. You can't get to me. The problem is that in those situations, when people have those issues, trust becomes a problem. It's not easy for them to develop trust because everybody is an enemy, right?
mm,
So you have to identify people in your life that you trust, okay? And let them know, okay, that you're going to slowly show them who you really are and what your fears are, okay? And if you're not able to do that with people you trust, you should seek professional help because those are underlying issues. But developing a relationship of trust becomes important. You have to utilize your social systems, and your support systems, church, social clubs, okay? Not cultish type of things, but things that allow you to express yourself in non-angry ways. I mean, I've been watching a lot of the mask debate, on TV, and actually getting into seeing some of the school board meetings where people go in and speak their minds. Wow, the degree of anger and insecurity and inability to connect with other people from a lot of those people in the meetings is astonishing, right? And then I said, purpose. What is the purpose of this? That kids don't use masks? I mean, is that the purpose? Do you really know what your purpose is when you stand up there and spitting out your guts and your anger and rage, you know? And I'm not talking about racism. I'm not talking about rejection of other cultures. I'm not talking about uh, political issues. I'm just talking about you, individual. What is your purpose? Yeah. And the understanding that at the end of the day, your anger and your fear hurts you more than others.
mm.
It isolates you from the world, right? And sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with you because you're all you have,
You only
right?
you.
Yeah. So if you all you have, ask yourself the question, what is this anger, frustration, and fear and rejection of the world and rejection of science and rejection of everything doing to me? Let alone your family and your community, right? You. Now, what I hear often when I bring these issues, people will tell me, um, well, that's my business, right? Okay. Then why are you here?
Mm,
And the reality is that very often the people who get to come to me don't come to me because they want to come to me. They come to me because of family issues, of anger issues, or legal issues, or substance abuse issues. But at the end of the day, it is a matter of listening and extending a hand. And I know that sounds kind of mushy, and romantic and stuff like that. No, those are the practical tools we have to get people included into the process. Okay. The more we reject them, the more they go into the famous bubble of misery, right? So we have to figure out how can we build some windows and some opening windows in that bubble of misery they're living in, because these people are not content.
mm.
They're not happy. Okay. And they have to be dealing with their anger and frustrations, and sooner or later it gets manifested, whether it's a school board meeting or in domestic violence or in substance abuse, you know. And can we rescue everybody from their bubble of misery? Absolutely not. But we have to try, and the most we can, the safer we all are, right? So there's there's a social contract, as we talked before. The most of us doing well is good for all of us.
Hmm.
Can everybody be content all the time? Absolutely not. I tell my patients all the time, I want to help you be as miserable as the rest of us, right? Because life is not a party, okay? Happiness should not be a purpose. Contentment should be a purpose. Happiness is a prize that you get, once in a while. It's like the dessert.
Well, that cherry on top, as we've mentioned it before. So,
Yes.
on the flip side of it, for those of us experiencing people with anger issues, and especially if they seem delusional or irrational, that should be a trigger for us not to be aggressive back, but to understand that, okay, click, I'm dealing with a frightened person here.
Yes, and I I deal with that every day, because I deal with violent kids, right?
Mm,
And I've dealt with emergency psychiatry all my life. I've always worked in the hospital. I run emergency psychiatry for Maricopa County, so this is it comes very natural to me to have to deal. And there's something about human behavior and violence, right? Uh, and I tell this to my students all the time. And when I had residents, I used to tell my residents, because I've had people getting hurt by not recognizing the potential for violence. And it's like we have to listen to our gut feeling, right?
mm,
If you're in a situation where your gut feeling, especially when you're in a one to one with a person who's potentially dangerous, and your gut feeling tells you that it's time to get out of there, right? Don't. Um, I've had people hurt because they tried to talk out of violence, a paranoid patient, right? And you never try to do that with a paranoid patient, because the first thing the paranoid patient is, why is he doing that to me? Right?
mhm,
What is he trying to talk me out of? Whatever. So don't do that, right? So we have special ways of handling these things in psychiatric settings, but in the community in general, be able to feel the danger, be able to recognize that that's not a place where you want to be in, and move yourself away from that. Okay, don't think that you're weak. No, don't feel peer pressure. And this is something that I thought my daughters all the time. Get out of there, right? Listen to your gut. If it's not, if it doesn't feel safe, it's probably not safe. So just get out of there. Um, so the same thing happens when you're in an argument with someone, right? You see that things are escalating. The second thing that you do is, when you are in a situation where you feel threatened, is don't look at the person in the eyes,
mm,
right? There are very few things as threatening to another human being as eye contact. And if somebody is escalating and you keep threatening with your eye contact, something bad's going to happen. So pull back, head down, be weak and be humbled, right? Because we're talking about your safety, right? So in those acute situations, listen to your gut, remove yourself from the situation. Don't be threatening to the other person. Don't try to demonstrate that you are more powerful than they are, because what they're working out of is fear.
mhm.
Okay. They can be working out of narcissistic rage, which is even more dangerous. And that can be very, very serious in terms of how they will react violently.
You said to walk away. In my side of the fence with the personal protection training, I say this a lot to people. I said, once you've developed a certain amount of skill set and confidence in yourself, walking away from a confrontation may look like you're running away to other people, but it feels different inside, and that's so important to have that confidence. Understand, feel that threat accelerating. Remove yourself from the situation and be okay with it. I think that's also a little bit of an issue. People are afraid, I guess you mentioned before, to look weak, to be weak. Some of the most dangerous people I know, I've seen them in social situations where maybe we're at a drinking hole or something like that, and some guy starts mouthing off, and boy, you've never seen people become more humble and more submissive, and they walk away from it. And these are guys who could literally kill everyone in the room. Right? That's
Yeah,
just how they are because there's that level of quite frankly just being confident.
exactly. So confidence comes with being humbled, you know,
And that's why
and
they have gone. They've been humbled before, absolutely.
exactly, and being self-secured.
Yeah.
So let me just say one more thing before we go, Vincent, because it came to mind that our kids, I mean, I would say kids from this century, 2000 forward, have been so monitored and overprotected that two things have happened. They think they know more in recognizing bad situations than they really do. And because of the overprotection, they don't have a lot of exposure
Mhm.
to danger. So they make a lot of mistakes, and I see them in the hospital all the time, in that they're not able to recognize danger. So there's two sides to this. One is we need to start being so overprotective and start moving our kids away from one box to another all the time. Um, to the kids being allowed, okay, and encouraged to recognize risk, to be in situations that are controlled, so they can have the experience. Because if you don't have the experience to recognize danger, you'll be totally clueless,
Mm.
right? And I'm not saying that my generation, I'm a late baby boomer, uh, from the early '60s. Um, we didn't have a choice, right? We weren't necessarily just raised by helicopter parenting. We were raised by the community, so there was a lot of risk for mischief, and people got hurt, right? And so that was the bad side of it. The good side of it is that we walk into places and we know that we don't belong there,
Mhm.
right? And that we have to get out of there. So we need to find a better balance between protection and recognition of risk for the kids to have a better self-esteem, being more self-secure, because we can't teach that. You know,
It's an
that's not.
empirical thing. They have to just go through it and learn it the hard way, I guess. But with protection, as you mentioned,
Yeah,
I liken it to sparring in martial arts. It's not a real fight, but it's pretty close, and you do it controlled, and you do it with safety. But you push that person to that point where you they understand what it's really like.
yeah.
Some of the other training we do is very similar. And you're right. A lot of these helicopter parents have put such a bunch of bubble wrap around these kids so much that once that bubble wrap comes off, they're completely and utterly exposed.
Yeah, and you see one, and it usually reminds me of one of my professors used to tell me, "Listen, Lauro, we raise our kids with values and information from the time they're born to the time they're 12 or 13. After that, we contain them, okay, and we want to continue raising them when we should be containing them.
Mm.
So we hope that when our kids hit puberty and adolescence, they're going to be able to use their values and the information that was provided from them before that. But it's a risk that we're taking too. They may use them or may not use them, right? And it's complicated. There's not like the perfect parenting, but there's got to be balance in terms of praise and frustration. And we need to learn to frustrate our kids the right way.
The last parallel I'll make before we go is again in this personal protection we talk about, avoiding any issues you can, mitigating them as much as possible, developing that confidence and facing those fears so that you don't have to act out aggressively. And for the rest of us out there, if you having a conversation or interaction with somebody, they seem to be acting out in overwhelming aggression, understand that is typically based in a certain amount of fear. It may not be, but it probably is. Listen empathetically, don't take it personally. If it escalates enough, get out of the situation. If they do open up and invite you to ask those questions, be empathetic. Ask them what you can do to help them, and maybe we can all move along past this fear so that we can have a better life and a better society. Thank you again, Doctor, for your joining us and giving us a little bit of your wisdom today.
Thank you, Vincent. And it was a pleasure being with you again. And just to remind everybody, if you don't want to get a vaccine, ask yourself, what is my purpose of not getting a vaccine and what am I afraid of? You'll have a good night. Thank you.
Take care.